Hi, my name is Caitlin Lee, and the topic that I chose was climate change global policies. So, to understand the policies put into place to lower global warming rates, we must understand what climate change is. Climate change refers to how temperatures in the climate overall will change long term. And this is typically not an issue. However, in recent decades, industrialization and human activities have caused the climate to increase at an alarming rate. Since 1980, the average global temperature has risen 1.98 degrees Fahrenheit. And this doesn't typically seem like a lot, but when you look at the rates previously, as shown in the graph below by NASA, we can see how the temperature spikes in the past few decades. Greenhouse gases are essential to the development of people by keeping the sun's heat in the atmosphere to make Earth livable. However, with the lasting impacts on climate from deforestation and industrialization, the greenhouse gas levels have increased rapidly, causing the climate change to change. So, what is the concern here? How has this impacted humans and animals and just the environment in general? Basically, the shift in weather patterns causes sea levels to rise, which results in floods. Food and plant production growth is not consistent. Droughts from warmer temperatures and its impacts on the rate of evaporation causes droughts to last longer. Ice glaciers are melting, and the habitat for animals like polar bears may be in danger. Climate change can severely impact the air quality as a result of air pollution and how often natural disasters occur. Can global warming be slowed, and what can we do? The short answer is yes, it can. Countries have all gathered to meet in the United Nations presenting ideas and solutions, which brings us to a few examples of the yearly conference of the United Nations, starting with the two main focus ones, the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. The Kyoto Protocol is known as one of the most significant treaties negotiated regarding climate change. The Kyoto Protocol was adopted on December 11, 1997 and began on February 16th of 2005. 192 parties were in agreement of and signed to the Kyoto Protocol. It basically calls on and asks parties to adopt policies to potentially limit and reduce six greenhouse gases and report back. They made this agreement binding for 37 developed countries, unlike the Paris Agreement that is unbinding. This means that it gives more responsibility for these countries because increasing greenhouse gas emissions may largely be a result of human activities in those countries specifically. Monitoring and review were pretty strict, and precise records have to be kept, and they were often fact checked. There was also the Adaptation Fund that was established to provide financial aid to developing countries. And some of the suggested means to meet these target goals are international emissions trading, clean development mechanism, and joint implementation. How has this reduced rising temperatures? Are their global policies effective? Each country basically had their own goals, but within the first commitment period from 2008 to 2012, all 37 industrialized countries, as mentioned previously, including the European Union, were with the binding targets, had a 5% emission reduction in comparison to the levels in 1990. And in continuation of the Kyoto Protocol was the Doha Amendment. The UN Climate Change Conference was held in Doha, Qatar on December 8th of 2012, which was after the first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol. And 147 parties accepted the Doha Amendment that passed on December 31st of 2020. And this amendment is basically an extension of the Kyoto Protocol, like a second commitment from 2013 to 2020. They basically addressed issues with the first commitment, like whatever issues that they had in it. And the main goal was to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 18% compared to the previous 5%. And we have not received full updates from the completed Doha Amendment of the second commitment, I believe. And there's also the Paris Agreement, which I mentioned earlier, also known as the Paris Climate Accords. World leaders got together at the UNCCC, which is the UN Climate Change Conference, or COP21, in Paris in late 2015 to discuss long-term goals to slow climate change, coming to the conclusion of the Paris Agreement. This legally began on November 4th, 2016, which was about a year later, and 194 parties joined the Paris Agreement. The target was to, one, obviously reduce greenhouse gas emissions to possibly limit the increasing temperature to below 2 degrees Celsius, but really the main target was to get below around 1.5 degrees. That's kind of where we wanted to stay at. And it was under the Paris Agreement, it was mandatory for each country to submit their action plan of efforts to slow climate change to the NDC, also known as the Nationally Determined Contribution, every 5 years. It should also list plans of how they're going to adapt to higher average temperature as well. What was optional was the long-term low greenhouse gas emission development strategies, or LTLEDs. Under the Paris Agreement, third world and underdeveloped countries will receive financial assistance. It isn't binding, meaning that countries can take risks in relation to their commitment. And at the UNCCC on November 20th of 2022, which was just a week ago in Egypt, a fund was made to compensate developing countries for the natural disasters caused by climate change. And a few other notable climate change conventions would be COP25 in Chile of 2019 and COP26 in Glasgow in 2020, where they discussed and reaffirmed that efforts to lower the global average temperature rise should be kept below 1.5 degrees Celsius, as I mentioned earlier, and also the reduction of the use of fossil fuels, which is one of the biggest contributors to climate change, and the urging of funding as for $100 billion USD, because this was a previous goal that they had before this UNCCC meeting or the convention, but they didn't meet it. So they're urging other countries to contribute to this as well. And then delving into sort of a subtopic, I'd like to zone into the US. How has the US in specific handled the situation, and what is in their NDC, or Nationally Determined Contribution? During President Obama's presidency, the US pledged to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 26 to 28% by 2025. And because of COVID-19, we reached 21.5% below the 2005 levels, which was nearing our goal. However, it isn't predicted to reach the 26 to 28% threshold, as stores are slowly opening up and the pandemic is becoming more and more controlled. And then President Trump, he signed out of the Paris Agreement when he was president, and then a few hours after President Biden got elected, he re-signed the Paris Agreement, and he pledged to cut emissions from electricity to zero by 2035 and achieve net zero emissions by 2050. And then here are my sources. Thank you.